In here, I feel sort of a weight of responsibility. I'm the first speaker in the series, so I must do a good job. And I'm very happy to see so many people. So, as Steve correctly pointed out, this is a continuation of a research that I was doing on the change in nature of business cycles. And towards the end of this presentation, we get into a little more of a discussion of what's in that study that he showed you, and there's probably a few copies if people wanted to pick up.
You mentioned there are several copies in this report on the table heading out, so if you rush and find other folks, you can probably get it.
All right, but the presentation today focuses mostly on the behavior of employment and jobs in the business cycles, the jobs aspect of it. So here is what I want to talk about today. Here is the outline. So first, I'm going to very briefly describe how employment and jobs normally behave, on average in the business cycle. And then we talk a little bit more specifically about this most recent recession, which was in 2007 and 2009. And especially the recovery that followed, or the non-recovery, as some people call it, that followed the recession. This is to set the background for why I'm suspecting there might be a change in the way economy behaves. And then I'm going to tell you how economists think about this, the link between economic growth and employment. And we'll talk about what might be happening, why are we having the jobless recoveries, or what's driving them, and then what is driving this change in the link. Because what's happening, I think, is that the link between output and economic growth on one side and jobs on the other side is not what it used to be. And we want to talk about possibly why. I don't actually have an answer to why, but I have several possibilities. All right. So here is what jobs normally do in a business cycle. Now, the part of the business cycle that most people are worried about is called the recession. This is when output of the economy is shrinking. So recession starts at the peak of the business cycle, the really, really good period, when everything is great until it's not great. And that's so. When economy stops growing and starts shrinking, that's the beginning of the recession. And then when it starts growing again, it's the end of the recession, but that's also the trough or the bottom of the cycle. This most recent recession ended in June 2009. June 2009 didn't feel like the economy was doing great, because it wasn't. It was at the very bottom of the cycle. It's like the worst, it's the darkest before the dawn period. And then we start growing, the output starts growing. That's the end of the recession. Jobs tend to follow the same pattern. They stop dropping in the beginning of the recession and they start growing towards the end, after the recession is over, but they don't have to. Recession is defined by what the economic output is doing, not what the jobs are doing. And this is important, because what's happening, what I'll show you is happening, is that jobs are no longer doing what they used to do, especially at the end of the recession. Now, I have been doing this research about business cycles for 8-ish years. So I know by heart when each recession has happened in this country, but you probably don't. So for that reason, I'm putting up this list up here. Since World War II, because this is the period we all economists use for this, because we have good data since World War II and not such a good data before that, we had 11 recessions. These are the dates of them. A few things that I want you to notice from here. Okay, so here is the latest one that you all probably remember. Started in December 2007, ended in June 2009. That's exactly 7 years ago. It lasted 18 months. So when people say this was the longest recession since World War II, that is true. But it's not that much longer than a couple other ones. There were a couple of 16-month long recessions. So it was worse in several dimensions than all the other recessions, but not dramatically, at least as far as how long it lasted. But in general, recessions last a lot less than that. There are, short ones, 8 months, 10 months, and so on. So here's just a picture. We have 11 recessions, and I'm going to talk a lot about this one. And also, what I want you to do is draw like a mental line over here between everything that happened before 1985 and everything that happened after. Just remember that after 1985, there are 3 recessions: 1990, 2001, and 2007, because I'm going to talk about them like right about now. What I want to do is to look at the behavior of jobs, employment in recessions. it used to be, so here's what this is a complicated chart. I'm going to explain this slowly. And this is going to take a while. Oops. OK, out here, all these gray lines that you can't really distinguish and they're not labeled, those are all those recessions before 1985. Each line shows one separate recession. And these are the 3 ones that are special, I think, and they're colored. Here's what, this is one of the ways I compare business cycles, and I do this a lot. You sort of align them all by the beginning of the recession, the peak of the business cycle. And then you see what happens, in this case, to employment, number of jobs, from that point on. So, for example, this big purple line is this most recent recession. So this is December 2007. Jobs start slowly falling, then they fall fast, up through 18 months later. Over here, the recession ends. But the jobs keep disappearing. And then they slowly start going back up. And I continue this chart until the number of jobs reaches the number we had before recession happened. So for each of these recessions, I go as far as until we get to a point where we regained all the lost jobs. We still haven't gotten back to the previous trend, because trend is supposed to be up. But we just gotten back to the point before we've fallen off the cliff. So this is why all these ones are grayed out, because all those other recessions, it took something around less than 2 years to get back to the pre-recession state. In this one, it took some like 6 years from the beginning of the recession to get back to it, because this is 78 months later. Another thing that you notice here is that this was definitely one of the biggest job losses. At the worst point, we were 6% and change below where we started. But there were some of the ones in the past that were equally as bad as far as how deep they went. They just that they went back up real fast, and we didn't do it this time. So here is what I want you to remember from this chart. The special thing that happens of these 3 latest recessions is that they exhibit jobless recoveries afterward. A jobless recovery is a situation where economy is already growing, output is going up, but jobs are still being lost. In each of these recessions, the best example, the easiest one to see is this purple one, like I said. Recession ends 18 months after the beginning. Recession lasts 18 months. From here to here, that's 18 months. From this point on, economy is growing. You get all these official statistics that says recession is over, we added this much percent to GDP and so on, but jobs keep going, keep disappearing. And this was the point when people were saying, what recovery? Where is the recovery? There's no recovery. And even once the jobs start growing, they do this very slowly. 2001, you may or may not remember, the recession was only 8 months long. So it ends right about here. And then for more than a year, we keep losing jobs. Slowly, but we keep losing them. And then slowly coming back up. So that recession was not deep. It was not long, but the recession itself ended right around here. But it took forever to get the jobs back. So that's what a jobless recovery is. And jobless recovery is a fairly recent phenomenon. We're seeing them in the last 3 ones, and not so much in the earlier recessions. And that's the first point that I'm trying to deliver, is that jobless recoveries followed the 3 recessions since 1990. It's this feature, the absence of recovery of jobs, that makes this recession special. And the latest recession in 2007, 2009 was particularly bad as far as this goes. There was a lot of jobs lost. They were being lost even after the economy was growing, and it took many years to just get back to the same number of jobs we had before. So it's the behavior of jobs that makes this recession special. The behavior of output, GDP falls and then grows back up, wasn't all that dramatically different from how it used to be in other recessions. So it's the jobs that makes them special, and especially not so much what the jobs are doing in the downturn. We'll lose jobs in downturn, that's not a surprise. But what they're doing in the recovery phase. So recoveries are different. That's why I want to compare recoveries now. I'm just going to take this opportunity since this is June of 2016. So we're exactly 7 years into a recovery. June of 2009, when official recovery has started, as in GDP was growing every quarter since then. Well, on average. There were a couple of quarters where it didn't, but for the most part, economy was growing. So 7 years later, as of today, I want to compare what this recovery feels like 7 years into a recovery compared to the past recoveries at this same point. Now, in that long list of 11 recessions and recoveries, there's only 3 of them that lasted longer than 7 years of the cycles. Therefore, I can only compare today to those past 3 episodes. And those are in the 60s, in the 80s, and in the 90s. So here is a comparison, numerical this time. What I'm comparing is what happened to GDP, that's the gross domestic product or the overall output of the economy, and employment, number of jobs. 7 years into a recovery compared to the point pre-recession. So the best point of the economy, then you drop, then you go 7 years up. So where you are on here compared to here. In the 60s, by the time recovery lasted 7 years, GDP was up 40% compared to pre-recovery, meaning we gained everything we lost and then a good chunk on top. And employment was up 22%. Again, we recovered all the jobs that we lost and then added a good chunk of this. In the 80s, slightly lower numbers, but still fairly similar. In the 90s, again, slightly lower numbers, but still decent. Today, GDP is 10% higher than it was in December 2007. We only have 4% more jobs. Like we recovered everything we've lost, but we added like a little tiny slice on top. And it took 7 years to do that. So what you see is that you have a dramatically slower growth of jobs than we had in other similarly long cycles. We also have slower GDP growth, but the difference is not that big. Is not as dramatic. But there is a slower growth of GDP and really, really much slower growth of jobs. So, how do we make sense of all this? By we at this point, I mean economists. Of course, long time ago, economists knew that there is a link between economic output and jobs, and this is not exactly surprising, right? In order to produce things, you normally have to employ people to do that most of the time. The first systematic study of this was done by Arthur Ocon in 1962. He looked at the link between output growth and the unemployment rate, because that's one of the measures of how jobs are doing. The idea, how does the link what are the steps that link output growth to unemployment? This is probably obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. So various factors affect aggregate demand in the economy. Income, consumer preferences, lots of things. So aggregate demand can change. When firms see that demand for their product is changing, they adjust employment, but not exactly one-to-one, meaning if your demand goes up 10%, you don't add 10% more workers. You probably add less. Because you can, at first you adjust other things. You adjust hours, before you go and hire somebody. Similar in a downturn. If demand for your product drops, you don't go lay off people immediately, because it's costly to then, if you lay off them now and then you have to find somebody later, it's trouble, it takes time, it's costly. So you might want to cut back on hours first to do something else, and only later you will consider if the demand is still low, you will consider laying off people. So this first connection. Changes in demand, changes in employment, but not one-to-one. And then, of course, when the changes in employment happens, companies lay off people or they hire people, that affects the unemployment rate. But again, not one-to-one. If you add 1% more jobs, unemployment rate does not drop 1%. It drops less than that because people can move in and out of the labor force. One of the things that happened, at least in the past recoveries frequently, is when economy really starts growing and adding a lot of jobs, unemployment rate can even go up for a little bit, because what happens is, as more jobs are available, people who previously gave up looking for jobs and they were not officially considered to be unemployed, seeing job availability, they come back in the labor force and start looking for jobs, and they counted as unemployed, therefore, until they find a job. So there is this other connection between how much companies are hiring and the unemployment rate. That's also not exactly one-to-one, but related. And so Arthur Ocon he estimated the link between the first and the third. We have output, employment over here, and unemployment rate in the end. He did the link between output and unemployment rate. And when he estimated this in 1962, what he found, I'm going to spare you the actual equation, what he found is that it takes around, GDP growth it takes about 3% of GDP growth to cut unemployment rate down by 1 percentage point. So if for unemployment rate to go down from, say, 6 to 5%, we have to have around 3% of GDP growth. This was based on what we would consider a short sample of data, not a lot of years. So as time went by, various other people re-estimated this relationship in the more recent data. And the modern answer to this question is 2.5 to 1, meaning it takes 2.5% of GDP growth to cut unemployment rate down by 1%. All right. But now we come to this puzzling result that I showed you at first. We have jobless recoveries after a recession. A jobless recovery is GDP is growing, but we're not getting additional jobs. So if the Okun's law, the thing I just told you about, says when GDP is growing, unemployment ought to be dropping, we ought to be getting some jobs, but we're not, or don't seem to be getting enough. So the question, when I was observing this for a while, the question occurred to me, well, is something happening? Is this relationship that we in economics call Okun's law, has it changed? Is it no longer doing what it used to do? So we have to investigate that with data. In AIER, we derive things from looking at a lot of numbers. Now, I will not show you equations or statistical tests, but I do want to show you a little bit how in general, data analysis is done on these things. So if you already know this, great, but I'm going to go through this anyway. So one way to graphically, I'm going to show you a picture that shows the relationship as opposed to a bunch of numbers. So one way to graphically demonstrate a link between two different things, two different variables, is what we call a scatterplot. There's a lot of dots that are going to appear here in a minute. The reason there's a lot of dots as opposed to a line or some other figure is because the relationships we look at in social sciences are not exact. It's not like physics or chemistry. So I'm going to first show an example, a fictitious data that I just made up, and then we're going to get to the real one about employment. Think about how, say, a relationship between height and weight of a person. Usually, taller people weigh more than shorter people in general. But of course, this varies from person to person. There are some really skinny tall people, and there are some not so skinny short people. So the relationship is not going to be perfect. If we go out and measure height and weight of a bunch of people, we're going to get data that's not going to all line up on the same line. It's going to be messy. And that's approximately how the messy data look like. I made up the numbers for the height and the weight of people, but that's what you will get. Each dot is a person. So let's say, here is a person that weighs well, let's pick one that's on the line, a little under 140 pounds and is 150 centimeters high. I'm European. I don't know how to do this in inches. So you can have 150 centimeters is a little shorter than me. But basically, you have a bunch of dots, each represents one person, and there is a statistical procedure that will put a line through it that we call the trend line. And the line sort of represents what the relationship is. If you show this to an economist, they say, oh, this is a pretty strong positive relationship. Means when one of these variables increases, so does the other, positive, we slope up. And the pretty strong means that these things are pretty much along the line. I mean, they're elongated this way. It's not just a random blob of dots. They're going, in a certain direction. And but of course, very few dots are exactly on the line. Most dots are somewhere around. And this deviation of the dot from the line is called a random error. There are some random things about it. Some people are built differently and so on. So these are the random errors that are away from the line. And how do I know they're random? Well, the line is in the middle, meaning there are about equal number of them on this side as there are on that one. The statistical procedure ensures that happens. So that's one of the easy ways, well, I don't know if it looks easy to you, but anyway, that's one of the ways we use to demonstrate the relationship between two variables. So now I'm going to use this method to demonstrate the relationship between the two variables we care about. Output growth on one end, unemployment rate on the other. That's what those dots look like. So what we have here is each dot is 1 year, somewhere between 49 and 2015. And it shows what the output did in that year. For example, out here, there's some year when output grew more than 8%. I kid you not, it was a long time ago. But there was one like that. And at the same year, unemployment rate went down almost 1 percentage point. Because unemployment rate is over here, the change in unemployment rate. 1 year here I can name you. That year right there is the year 2008, where GDP growth dropped more than 2%, GDP shrunk more than 2%, and unemployment rate went up more than 3 percentage points. This was the worst year of the recession. So basically, this also, when economists look at this is a pretty strong negative relationship. When one of these things gets larger, as output is growing faster, unemployment rate is dropping. And this line that's put here by a statistical method tells you that for unemployment rate to fall by 1 percentage point, output has to grow around 2.5%. Now, it's going to be magic happening. I'm going to highlight on this chart all the points that correspond to the latest recession and recovery after it, meaning 2007 and later is becoming red. All right, so I told you that's 2008, but these are other years from between 2007 and 2015. Without doing a lot of statistics here, here's what I want to point out to you. See how almost all of these red dots are below the line? The deviation between the dot and the line is supposed to be random error. Now, if you have 11 of the things going in the same direction, it ain't random. If they're all below, like have all below the relationship we think is supposed to be driving them, this is not very random. And the more, as the years go by, I'm going to keep adding dots to this chart. As we get more and more of them, and if they keep being below, I'm getting more and more certain that something is changing in the relationship. Because you can't have, you flip a coin 11 times and it all comes down heads. This is not random. So what it seems like is that the red dots are not really driven by this line that's in the middle, or they may not be. Now, then fancy statistics happens, all of which I'm skipping. But after doing the fancy statistics, here's what I find out. It is quite likely that somewhere around the year 2005 or shortly thereafter, there was actually a change in the statistical relationship that was on this chart. The fancy statistic doesn't allow me to figure out whether it happened in 2005, 6, or 7. There's not enough, we don't have many enough years after 2007 to do this. But somewhere around 2005 or slightly thereafter, there was probably a change. And the change had two, and the way that what changed is how much growth it takes to drop the unemployment rate down. Before 2005, it's this 2.5 to 1 relationship that we had for a long time. GDP grows 2.5% above what it normally does. Unemployment rate drops 1%. After 2005, it's 1.5 to 1. Meaning, in order for unemployment rate to drop, you actually don't need that much of a GDP growth as you needed before. Which, when I first saw it, I found totally counterintuitive, but it turns out it works. Because here's what this means. Two things have happened recently, in the last 10 or so years. In general, GDP is growing slower. In technical terms, it means trend growth of GDP has moved down. This is not the relationship between GDP and jobs. This is just the GDP ain't growing as fast as it used to, on average. But also, unemployment rate has become more sensitive to variations in GDP growth. That means, it might mean a good thing, because unemployment rate falls even with GDP growth not being very fast. Because GDP growth hasn't exceeded 2% by very much in the last several years, and we have unemployment rate at 4.7. But it also means a bad thing. When GDP is falling in a recession, we really lose a lot of jobs. And unemployment rate really goes very much up, much more than before, because unemployment rate is much more sensitive to GDP than it used to be. And on top of that, GDP isn't growing very fast. Here is the illustration of GDP not growing very fast. I realize this is only exciting for macroeconomists, but this is a chart we do all the time. All right, first, the gray bars on this are the periods of recession. This is the latest one. You see how wide it is? That's 18 months. This is the previous one in 2001. The reason it's so thin is because it was less than a year. And then all the other recessions since 1948. The blue line is how fast GDP was growing. And the red line is a particular way to figuring out the trend of GDP growth. It's a very strangely derived statistical average. You don't need to necessarily know how it's done. But here's what I want you to show you. Remember, I told you to let's do the mental break here in 1985. The red line before 1985 fluctuates around 4, maybe a little less than 4. So the average growth rate of GDP was almost 4%. And then it goes down. And average growth rate of GDP down here, where the red line is almost slightly is below 2, actually. Here is another thing that this chart is good for. One of the reasons why the GDP growth is slowing down, or one other way in which a slowdown of growth rate of GDP is manifesting itself, is that check out what happens in recoveries. So in every recession, right, gray line, GDP growth goes down and becomes negative in most of them. But then when the recession ends, GDP growth shoots back up way above the trend. And every one of these, see how it overshoots, goes way above the trend in every recovery, and this is the last occurrence of that, 1982. In the last 3 recessions that I'm telling you are special, it doesn't do that anymore. In the recovery, it just goes just tiny little bit above the trend. It goes above the trend, well, it's a little more, but not hugely. And on this one in particular, it goes above the trend, not a lot. So there is no huge rebound and overshooting and regaining all the lost jobs and regaining all the lost ground. It's not happening. That's what the jobless recoveries look like. We don't make up everything we lost. We just go back to the previous trend and sort of chug along without a spectacular growth, this is only the case in the last 3 recessions. Every time before, we had this huge overshoot and so that the economy could make up all the lost output and all the lost jobs. Here is another numerical way to show you this. This is what output growth is doing in all the old recessions prior to 1985 and all the 3 ones after that. A year before recession, in the past, output used to grow around 4-ish%. In a recession, it fell on average a little more than 1%. But then the year after, the first year of recovery, it shot all the way up to there. So that one point in the chart where I said that there was 1 year when it grew 8% and changed, that's not a joke. It grew 8%. It only was somewhere in the 50s. Now, in the last 3 recessions, here's what it looks like. The year before recession, we grow a little under 3%. That's already less than that blue one. In a recession, we fall about the same amount on average. Now, this is an average of 3 very different numbers. There's a huge drop in 2008 and a very small drop in 2001, and mediumly sized in 1990. But then in the first year of recovery, we grow almost exactly the same speed as before recession. There is no compensation, there is no overshooting, there is no compensatory growth. We're not making up the lost ground. We just go back to where we used to be. Which is one of the reasons for very slow recoveries, or why recoveries don't feel like recoveries. And also why we're not adding jobs so fast. Well, now there's one more statistical step that I did very recently. Try to figure out, so why? Well, what I know is that unemployment rate in recent years became much more sensitive to what output is doing. But why? What has changed in this link between unemployment and output? That link has 2 steps that I told you about earlier. Changes in output, changes how much jobs companies provide. That's a decision of companies how they adjust employment. Output, employment, the first step. And then by adjusting employment, companies affect the unemployment rate, and that step is affected by people's decision to look for jobs, to come in the labor force or out of the labor force. So the link between output and jobs comes from decision of companies to do something, and the link between jobs and the unemployment rate comes from the decision of people. And I can look in the data, try to figure out which of these two links are changing, or maybe both of them. The answer, it's the companies. The link between jobs and the unemployment rate is almost exactly the same as before. What has changed is how companies respond to a variation in the demand for their product. And again, the break is around 2005. Prior to 2005, what was happening is a 1% change in output changed employment, or the number of jobs, by around 0.5 percentage point. Which means something like, if a company sees that the demand for its product drops 10%, they may be lay off 5% of people, not 10%. And vice versa. If the demand is growing 10%, they maybe hire 5% more people and adjust everything else by going through overtime hours or something. After 2005, that link has gotten stronger. It's now for 1% deviation in output, we adjust employment by 0.8. In other words, demand for your product drops 10%, you lay off 8% of people, not 5 like before. On the flip side, your demand grows 10% in good times, you add 8% people, not 5. So what that basically means is that companies are a lot quicker to hire and fire people than they were before. Their adjustment margin is now employment. Add jobs or subtract jobs, as opposed to some other margins they used before, be that hours or overtime or something else. That explains why a falling out, that explains a couple things. One, when output falls, we lose a lot of jobs. Now with this new regime where companies just let go of people a lot easier than they used to. That explains why this last recession, where the output loss was large but not unprecedented, but the jobs loss was really much larger than we thought it should have been compared to how economies behaved before. On the upside, it means that even though we're not growing that fast right now and haven't been for years, we are adding more jobs than we would have in the old times. One big disclaimer here. Employment data that we use does not differentiate between full-time job or part-time job, good job with good income or not a good job with insufficient income, temporary versus permanent. None of these things are differentiated. Job is a job, meaning if a person worked for pay any number of hours in a month, they're employed. That's how the data is collected, which might be one of the explanations for this that I want to talk about. So here is what I'm finding, that now, in the recent years, somewhere around 2005 and later, companies are a lot quicker to adjust employment, meaning they're a lot quicker to fire people, and they seem to be able to find people when they need to add employment. Why might this be happening? Now, from this point on, this is my discussion. This is probably where I want to take the research in the future to figure out this in more detail. But here is my experience and my knowledge is telling me these are the possibilities. One has to do with recessions being mostly structural. This is going to be a very long explanation. This is what the study that Steve showed you was about. In that study, I argued that there are two kinds of recessions. One I call structural, and the other one, for lack of a better term, I called simple. A structural recession is such that during it there happens a significant restructuring of the way economy works. 2007 is a perfect example. When the recession was happening, it started from housing and then financials and related sectors and spread to the entire economy. it was pretty clear, probably by the around year 2009, to everybody, that even when we recover from this, the economy is not going to go back to doing exactly the same thing as before. Meaning, we're not going to go back to building as many houses. We're still not building as many houses this year as we did in 2006. We're not going to have as many loan origination officers. We're not going to have as many mortgage companies or mortgage offices. Some sectors are going to shrink permanently, and some other ones hopefully would grow. I'm less sure on the second part, but some sectors definitely shrunk. That's a structural recession, which means that once the recession is over and the growth starts, we're not going to go back to doing exactly what we were doing before. We're going to go do something different. A simple recession hasn't happened in a while, but if you dial back to something like 1961, is when there is a slowdown in demand for whatever reason. There could be a number of things that just temporarily people buy less stuff. That lasts for a few months, and companies cut back on employment, cut back on output. But then the problem goes away, and the things recover, and we go back to doing the same thing as before. We're making the same washing machines and building the same houses and about the same quantity as before. Why the distinction is important? Because if the recession is simple, and you're fairly sure, both as an employer and as an employee, that some months later, 8, 10, things are going to go back to the way they were before, then you probably, even if you are laid off, you're going to go back to doing the same job or the same kind of job. And if you're a company, you might not want to fire people because you're going to need them later. These same people doing the same things, 10 months later. So we might want to put them on part-time or something, but not totally let them go. If you're in a structural recession, you don't know that. You don't know as a company that you're going to need the same kinds of people. You might need totally different kinds of people. Or, which also happened in a structural recession, the company might not be around later. One of the ways we really cut down on the number of mortgage origination offices is by a couple of these places that used to do mortgage origination went out of business. If you remember Countrywide Financial, I was one of the big mortgage lenders that went heavily into subprime. It's not around anymore, and most people who work there don't work there or anywhere else, I suppose, in the mortgage industry anymore. Some part of them got bought off by Bank of America, so some people did go back to financial industry, but most of them didn't. In other words, when you have a significant structural reallocation, the economy sheds jobs faster, either because companies realize this and they want to restructure themselves faster to survive, or they don't realize it and they don't survive and the jobs still disappear. And then on the the recovery side, then these people don't really go back to the same kind of job. I'm pretty sure if you wanted a mortgage officer in the year 2010, you could have gotten one for any small amount of money you wanted to. I don't know why you would need one. But so people start looking for completely different jobs, which takes much longer for them to then, you have to find out what other jobs exist. What jobs can I do? What skills do I need? How do I even talk to the other kinds of companies and so on? That contributes to recovery in jobs being slower. So one guess that I have for why we're seeing this much faster response of companies to GDP fluctuations as they let go of people a lot faster is because this recession that happened after 2005 was structural and a big one. So we had this big structural reallocation where you have to let go of companies because either you will do and you will survive or you will not and you will not survive and people will still be out of a job. Another couple ideas that I have for what might be happening in the recovery. Now that, when we are adding jobs, not a lot, especially not last month, but because the last month's employment report showed only 38,000 jobs being added in the U.S. economy, which is a very, 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 very small number, if I didn't make myself clear, very small number. But what might be happening from anecdotal evidence, and I will have to look into this more formally with data, is that the jobs that are being added are not the kind of jobs that used to exist in years past. A lot of at least there is some evidence that companies are adding a lot of temporary jobs or part-time jobs, the jobs that are very easy for them to adjust. It's not as costly to hire somebody temporarily in terms of not just in terms of what you pay them, but also in terms of the process of how you find an employee. Because temporary employee, you don't like them, they go. Permanent employee is a little more difficult. And so companies spend more time and effort to select permanent employees than they would temporary. So there seems to be, and again, I haven't really checked this fully formally in data, but at least the things I hear seem to indicate that the part-time and temporary kinds of jobs is what was growing in this recovery more so than in the past. And that might be a way in which companies can easily add people when they need to. And when they don't need to, these people go. And that's a faster response of employment to output fluctuations. You need a little more people, you can get somebody temporarily, you don't need them, they go. And so this is why employment follows demand very closely. And finally, something that, since I'm a macroeconomist, I don't know quite so much about how labor markets function, but I wonder whether something is happening within the labor market that make it easier for employers to find people on short notice. Because if they can find them on if the companies are sure that they can find people on short notice, then that is what makes them a lot less reserved when they need to fire somebody. Because if I know I can find somebody I need whenever I need them, then I will let the workers go as soon as there is a problem. As soon as there's any downturn in demand, gone. Because the only thing that prevents companies from firing people right away when the demand turns down is that it's going to take a lot of time and effort to then find them. But if there is something happening in the labor market, like there is a lot of people who are sort of available or willing to work even though if they're not unemployed, or people who are, how do we put this, semi-retired, so to speak, experienced people you can find that are not necessarily, that wouldn't take you a lot of time to find. Or there is some people argue hidden unemployment. There are long-term unemployed people who been unemployed so long they gave up hope, and they're not formally considered unemployed if they're not looking for a job, but you can still get them as a company if you wanted to. These are sort of my guesses, and this is where I would like more discussion, which we're going to do in a minute. But these are sort of the various factors that I think are probably happening in some combination that could contribute to companies being able to adjust employment a lot easier and a lot faster than they used to. So I'm going to recap everything I told you, and then we can talk, or answer your questions, or hear your input. So what I found in the research is that the Great Recession, that's the name of the recession that happened in 2007, 2009, and the jobless recovery that went after it probably represents a shift in the link between output and employment. And this change, the two things that changed around 2005 or 6. Output growth has been slower on average. Economy is not growing as fast as it used to. And companies are adjusting employment a lot more readily to a change in output than they did before. They both let go of people faster in a downturn, and they're able to find people when they need on an upturn. And the thing I would plan on doing in the future is finding out why. What happened that allowed companies this flexibility that they didn't have before. I also want to point out, that we on the website, on AIER.org, have a bunch of other research. So if you want to get a copy of the change in nature of recession study, is the study about the structural and simple recessions that Steve showed you, and we have a few printed copies, but you can also download it. We also have research reports that come out every month, and I think this is an example of the most recent one about where the college grads usually go for the best employment options. Every month we have a business conditions monthly. This is a report that looks at a lot of data about the economy and analyzes where we are in the business cycle and how the economy is doing. And this would also be a report where, should we ever start entering the next recession, we're going to warn you about it. This is what the Institute has been doing since its very beginning, and we're reasonably good at that. One of the very popular things we have on our website is a cost of living calculator that allows you to compare what it costs, the value of money of any year between 1913 and right now. Like if you want to know what $100 in 1913 would be how many dollars right now? A lot more than 100. I don't know the answer, but the people like that one. And we also have an everyday price index that we release on the website. This is an index that I created some years ago when we were hearing from people, actually quite frequently, that the official inflation numbers do not correspond to what people see in their life. Like, there was, inflation right now is what, 1%-ish or so, something like that in the consumer price index. And people are telling me that, but my costs are right. This is not what I see. And after many enough complaints about that, we decided to create this index that only tracks the prices of what we call everyday purchases, the things you buy regularly, and therefore that's what really affects your household budget. Things like food, gasoline, utilities, toothpaste, that kind of stuff. And it turns out that, it does in fact grow faster than the official inflation, it seems. And we release it every month, and you can download it from the website. All right, at this point, I'm gonna put my contact information on up there, and we can open this for questions or comments or anything you'd like. Oh, please.
You lose sight of something in your whole presentation about electronics, the new age of electronics and what's happening as far as employment is concerned. Electronics has come in and taken a lot of jobs.
Oh, you mean just permanent replacement of people with...
Absolutely. And if you take a look at the automotive industry that used to be one of the largest employers in the world, no longer. It's all automated. Not all, but heavily automated. Where are those people going to go? They're going to be out, number one. Number two factor, you're losing sight of how long people are on the unemployment list. After a reasonable period of time, they fall off the page.
True.
And they never, ever come back.
Come back to employment, you mean?
Yeah, they don't come back. They don't work the unemployment. It's heavy.
Yes.
And I am a firm believer that the economy today is in terrible shape. I think it's terrible. And I think there is an awful lot going on worldwide that needs to have change. If you take a look at what's going on, and I'm not even going to bring up and labor politics, but you take Walmart, hires people on a part-time basis. They don't have to pay their benefits. Predominantly, their employment force is 20 hours.
Probably true.
That really disturbs your economic approach.
Well, yeah, I'm both things you point out are clearly going on. So the first one about replacing people with equipment, basically, automating jobs out, that's a long-term trend. I mean, this has been happening for something 30 or so years. And this is clearly a force. I mean, I'm not going to argue it's not happening. It's important. It's an important force that, for example, shrinks manufacturing jobs in the U.S. We have something like,
We've shipped them all overseas.
yes, we have something like 8% or 9% of the labor force is manufacturing. And back in the day, in say 1960s, it was something like 35% was manufacturing, or 30%. So that is clearly happening, and this is it sort of underlies everything else that's going on. Although because I'm looking more along the lines of what happens in the cycle, up and down, I abstract from the more longer term. Not to say they're not important, clearly important, but it's happening everywhere in all the cycles. Now, on the part-time jobs and the kind of jobs that we not get, people are saying the jobs we're getting now, a lot of jobs that are out there that are officially employed are not great. They're part-time, they don't pay a lot, there's no benefits. That is probably one of the reasons why companies are so easily able to adjust employment. Because you get somebody part-time, you let them go, you get somebody else part-time. So I acknowledge that's happening, and I'm guessing that's one of the reasons for my result. One of the several ones. I haven't fully investigated to figure out exactly how much it contributes, but it's clearly, I would agree very much that this is clearly one of the things that are going on. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I found it really informative. And fascinating, the statistics that you put up about employment and recessions and so forth. I can't help but wonder at the D in GDP, are we redefining that differently now as we did? Because what actually is a domestic product now compared to what it was in 1985? What percentage of that is actually coming from this country? Which percentage of it is being manufactured someplace else? And,
Okay.
you know, are we looking at it differently? I don't know.
Well, let me try to think out loud. Now, the GDP, the gross domestic product, is the value of everything that's produced within the U.S. borders. That seems to say that, well, then it should be the same. I mean, we're producing different things now than we were producing in 1980, clearly, but
Parts
but-
are being made someplace else and being assembled.
yes. But so at first it seems simple. Everything that's produced on this territory we still count. But then when parts are being made somewhere else and assembled here, or when something's made somewhere else and the profits come here, there needs to be there's an accounting for somehow you sort of split the value of how much is produced out, how much is produced inside. I haven't really looked at I don't think the methodology for doing that has changed much. But what might be changing is how complex the production process is happening. You know, previously when the steel is over there, you move tires, make tires over there, put them on a car over here. That's relatively easy to account. But when things become services, when things become less tangible, it might be more questionable as to how you account for it. I don't actually know the answer to this, but it's possible.
The closer, if more of that was being done offshore, maybe that's one of the reasons that the difference between the movement in GDP and the movement in unemployment went from 1 to 2.5 to 1 to 1.5.
Because GDP ain't what it used to be. Yeah,
Right.
it could be. That's an interesting thing to look into. Thank you. Neil.
One of the big differences, we'll say, between now and 30 or 40 years ago is makeup of what we actually buy. Back then, durables were far bigger than services, and now services are begun to be bigger than durables. And so we had a typical cycle like in the 50s or 60s, was heavily driven by inventory. We bought too many cars and then we let off here too. And so that was kind of a typical thing across the recessions. 80, 82, and in the current one, we're kind of restructuring the Rust Belt and the World Patch got clobbered in the action from 80 to 85. And so that was structural. And but the mix changed dramatically. And we really had a huge sections of the economy that were totally restructured.
Yeah, so I think the thing that you describe and the shift in the composition of consumption, basically, that the services are becoming a much bigger share of consumption and a much bigger share of the economy as a result, that might explain why we mostly have the structural recessions now. Not because one of the big driving forces of the simple recession, things got worse and then they got better, was the inventory cycle, like I said.
And we also exported durable manufacturing.
Yes.
Which was what caused the recession to
Yeah, so the durable. So even if we were to have the recession driven by durables, which we're not likely, but that doesn't affect quite as many workers in this country because most of the durables are made somewhere else. So yeah, so what you're describing would make it less likely that we have a simple short recession, and more likely that we have the structural bad ones. Although they wouldn't happen quite as often, which is also what we're seeing. These cycles now are long. The space between recessions is longer than, on average, than it used to be. Because like I said, we're 7 years into a recovery. There's only 3 other cases of that so far. So yeah, please, you were waiting.
I think there needs to be more emphasis, as the first gentleman mentioned, on the changing nature of the workforce. I think we have to look at this against the backdrop of what's happening in America today, the election being a prime example. What accounts for the strength on the left of Bernie Sanders, the strength of who on the right, the fact that the workforce has changed in a lot of ways. Wages have remained basically stagnant in most of the industries. We go all the way back to the 1980s, and when you allow for the difference due to inflation, wages have remained almost constant. And as a consequence, the average worker no longer has the buying power and There's all kinds of indexes that indicate that. We've got 3 or 4 million people who have lost their homes. We have the lowest home ownership rate that we've had in many, many decades.
Correct.
We've got people who have lost all of their savings. Huge numbers of what used to be middle-class people have now dropped into the so-called lower class based on their statistical income. You've got an increasing tendency toward shipping jobs overseas. General Electric, which most of us know about, now has more workers outside of the United States than it has on its workforce within the United States. So consequently, because of all of these factors, there's no way that when we have a recession that we're going to have the fairly rapid return to form, so to speak, that we used to have. People don't have the money to spend. People are saddled with debts. We've got several million students who have staggering debts due to the $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 that they've racked up in costs of attending college. So when you add all of this together, there's no surprise in the least that the recessions are lasting longer and having greater staying power than they had before, and that even when we technically come out of a recession, as we have in this one, people laugh when they say, you know, where's the end of the recession? We're still in the recession. It's true from a technical standpoint, we've emerged from it. But again, millions of people have not emerged from it. We have a huge number of people who have given up ever finding a job. That's one reason that the unemployment rate remains low. I think that's something that has to be stated. If we included those people who have given up looking for a job, if we included the people who are working part-time but desperately need full-time in order to just pay their daily bills, the unemployment rate would be a lot higher than it is. Figures I've seen indicate that the true unemployment rate, and I'll put that in quotes, is probably double or very close to what the Bureau of Labor Statistics issues as the unemployment rate. So when you look at all of those figures, one or two others I want to throw out. One is the factor of growing automation. You can say, well, we've always had automation. That's true. But we also know that when we study inventions, the more things that are invented, the greater the rate of invention increases. There are more elements to work with, so we invent new things more rapidly. Consequently, while we have always had automation, we have an increased rate of automation, and this has resulted in far fewer people doing the jobs that used to be done by many. I was in Detroit back in the last part of the last century when we had 80,000 workers at one plant turning out Fords at the River Rouge plant. That plant is totally closed, and furthermore, the work that those 80,000 auto workers did can now be performed by approximately 20,000 workers. So that's just one slight indication of how much work has been taken away from employees through the genius of man's ability to invent new things. So when you take all of these things into account, I think it's no wonder that the recessions are stretching out longer. I expect them to be still longer, and I still think we need to redefine a recession so that it really means when does the average working family get back on its feet.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have much to add to this. I have to write down your new definition of recession because I might be able to figure out from data, like if we were to redefine it this way, well, when the dates would be. I mean, it'll take a lot of work, but it might be actually possible. I might be curious, it might be an interesting point. I think you were waiting for comment on this, right?
No, I think he's right on it. He's hit it right on the head. Take a look at the number of households where we used to have one person working. Now you have two or more.
Yeah, I know that number.
In order for them to survive today, two people in a household generally are working.
Yes.
And I'll give you one other little side comment, because you can see I'm not a strong believer in Walmart. If Walmart goes down a few points in growth, watch what happens to the Chinese economy.
Oh, yeah.
I bet that there's probably a good number of suppliers to Walmart that are in Chinese economy.
2 ladies came to New York to look to buy American goods. 2 days later, they're on their way back to China.
Okay, and not. All right, go ahead.
Yeah,
We're gonna.
economist Richard Wolff, formerly of UMass, points out in one of his lectures that the United States had a labor shortage for about all of its history, up to around 1970.
Probably.
And since then, there's been a labor surplus. And I don't know, do you think that might be giving employers a little more flexibility in their ability to hire and fire?
That's an interesting idea, so let's think about it. That U.S. had the labor shortage for most of its history is true. I'm not exactly a historian, but I'm not ignorant of history. And that's also why U.S. had free immigration, as an unrestricted immigration until sometime in the middle of the 20th century, because there was always, something to do for people. And so people just came in, whomever wanted came in. So what you're saying is that we might be seeing a sort of a very long-term shift from a paradigm of there's always work for people to find to a paradigm where the company is now called, the employer is now called the shots. I mean, there's no longer a labor shortage. I wouldn't say that we're in a labor surplus. We're in the same situation most other countries are in. So it's whatever this is, the fluctuating equilibrium somewhere or fluctuating non-equilibrium something. But we're not in a labor shortage situation. So maybe over time, and people date this to something like early 80s or maybe mid 70s, when we actually moved in, the U.S. economy and U.S. employers moved into the same paradigm the rest of Europe lived in most of the time, as in the employers have more power than the employees for the most part. That could be. This is kind of a nice long historical look. I should write that one down too. Thank you. Yeah.
Women started coming in the workforce, that was in the 70s, when they came in big numbers. That's also when we started seeing family incomes be up with 2 workers instead of 1. So those are really intertwined with that huge surge. When I grew up, very few mothers worked.
Oh, you mean that's another source of additional workers?
Yeah, and the women's movement and women really moved into executive positions and so on. So that we really saw a big influx, and as that was absorbed, that's part of the thing that originally caused some of the problems in other places.
That's another thing that's actually happening lately since early 2000. Since around 2000, the rate of labor force participation of women hasn't changed, meaning it's gotten as high as it's going to be. It's a little below the one of men, but there's obvious reason for that. And so it's no longer growing, meaning we're basically employing as many women as we're going to be employing. Yeah, go ahead.
We can learn a lot from our history in this country. Whenever we had similar situations in the past, we usually instituted a tariff. So if we were losing jobs in China, let's say, we'd say, and we all snicker when we mention the name Donald Trump, but he is the only one who has said, if Mexico wants to sell their goods in America, then perhaps we need to tax Mexico. We used to call it a tariff. In 1879, President McKinley was in favor of such a thing, and it worked. And that's a wonderful balance. And it's something that we in America should think about. We don't do that.
Maybe that's another way in which the world has changed, in the sense that it's, now not considered the first line of reaction to talk about tariffs, with the WTO and everything else. That's not the policy that people think of first, second, or third on the list of addressing problems. And that might be another sort of a long-term change between back then and now, in the sense of now American workers are competing not only with other American workers, but with other workers in other countries, essentially. Indirectly, but that's still an impact. Yes, please.
In my opinion, which may be good or bad, tariffs is the worst thing that can happen. If you think about to begin, you raise the cost of goods by putting on an artificial tariff. It's an artificial price. Therefore, the consumer in this country has less money to use. it costs more to live, so that you're living now on a lower level than before the tariff. And that's what we're talking about, and what I gather from you exactly, you want to raise the income for people, you want to bring them up to the middle class, you want to make, you don't want to take money away from them. Tariffs takes money away from those people who can't afford it. It's only good for people who are very rich.
Well, the debate about tariffs in economics is around 200 years old or so. There are still to this day people on both sides of the debate. Now, if we do this pure economics, in economics, the criteria for things being good is economic efficiency, meaning we waste the smallest amount of resources. And economic efficiency says tariffs are horrible. And the first person who figured this out was David Ricardo around 200 years ago or so. But then there are other outside of the academic economic circle, there are other considerations like domestic jobs or income inequality or some other things that then modify this conversation. So my opinion on tariffs, I'm going to withhold because it's kind of irrelevant to what the country is going to do. The tariffs introduce additional costs that don't need to exist, and that's what the inefficiency is. But they also then reallocate production. That's your idea, or the effect you're looking for is that the production gets reallocated into U.S., or to some extent it does. The thing this is actual description of inefficiency, meaning it was clearly more efficient from totally resource perspective to produce it someplace else rather than the US. That's why it was there in the first place. So you move it into the higher cost country. But the efficiency is not an argument that people find appealing if they're not economists. I tried this on a lot of people in the past. It doesn't quite work because efficiency literally presupposes that people all around the world, everybody who is in a free trade, are on equal footing. They sort of compete against each other. Who is the most efficient in producing X? And that's where the production is going to go. And as soon as the next guy over here becomes more efficient, it goes that way. Most people don't like that. Most normal humans don't like that. And I can explain about efficiency till I'm blue in the face. People are still not going to like that. So there's always, I'm getting the sense that since we haven't figured this, the debate is not over 200 years later. It ain't going to be over anytime soon. We're going to have debate on both ends of this. And I guess it's fine. And the policies that are going to hopefully come out is some combination that makes the most people can live with. Although I'm not entirely confident in the political process in this particular case.
Well, the argument of the presentation you just made means that, well, when you have a tariff like we were talking about, it's true you get industry back, so they're benefiting a certain percentage of the people. I would venture to say that the percentage of people that are being disadvantaged is far greater than the number of people that are being advantaged. For example, the auto trade, you got an additional 80,000, for example. But the cost of people have to buy a car is how many millions of cars a year do they sell it?
Yes, the way this usually works is that the tariff increases, say, the price of a car by a little bit. It's not going to double it or increase it by 20%. It's going to increase it a little bit. So everybody who buys cars pays a little bit more, and that a little bit, most of it, not all of it, goes to the 80,000 workers or whomever's making the jobs that appeared because they're inside the country. So it's sort of a moving. The money doesn't appear out of thin air anywhere. So you more or less collect money from the customers who buy the cars, and they go to these workers. Now, people, I bet, would argue that's still okay because these workers are American workers, because right now they're going over to the Mexicans or whomever, what we pay for the cars. At least some of it is going to go back to somebody who's working here and spends money here and contributes to this economy. So I can see both sides of the argument, and I'm not going to be the judge to say which side is going to win. Yes.
So I agree that the role of technology is very important, but I want to come at it from a different aspect. The ability for people to crunch numbers now and the speed with which they can crunch numbers is enabling management, boards, and shareholders to just grab a hold of data in a very, very fast way and be able to react very, very quickly and say lean and efficient is a better way to go, better for shareholders.
That's a great idea. I didn't realize. So it's basically they can figure out things, way of optimizing things or whatever, reorganizing things that they previously just didn't figure out because they didn't have time to figure that out. Oh, something.
And then definitely what we're seeing is the talent in the temporary pool is much greater than it used to be. There are more people that are without job. And then the overall cost of benefits, we'll say to an employer, expendable. So we will let you go.
Because we can
now we're
always
not gonna
find
have to pay
somebody.
benefits, so I agree with you about the temporary workforce. But also the
But I like the effect on technology. Yeah, that's very cool. Thank you. That's a great idea. I have to think about it more because it's basically now the companies, the management of them can figure out optimization methods or schemes that previously wouldn't be thought of because it would be too complicated to compute, and now it could be done, in a span of several, I don't know, weeks or months or something. But they could react a lot faster to the things that are changing. Wow, thank you. Anyone? Oh, do we have any more questions? Yes, please.
In terms of the sluggish recovery you mentioned in the recent years, is part of the problem, again, whatever profits are being made are going to the top 10%, and again, our stagnant middle class that hasn't had a pay raise in 20 to 30 years doesn't have the buying power to further accelerate any really substantive recovery?
Well, yeah, that would be one of the reasons. That could be a contributing factor to why GDP isn't in general growing that fast, because presumably the conventional wisdom goes that if the income is distributed throughout the whole distribution, that the people on the lower end spend more of it than people on the high end. So that would be something that could contribute to slower GDP growth in general. It's not immediately clear to me whether it would contribute to this behavior of employers as far as hiring and firing. That's probably not. I'm not sure. Maybe there is a connection, just not a simple one.
Demand for your products, would you hire more people? Would you expand accordingly? Would the classic multiplier?
Yeah, but what we're saying is that now now that effect is larger than it used to be in decades past, and so that's probably related to things other than income inequality. But the income inequality part, or most of the gains going to the top, slows the demand. Makes the growth of demand in general slower because the top can only consume so much.
I just wonder if the problems or the issues with the actual unemployment number impacts your graphs and all your analysis and data, and the fact that if there are more people that are discouraged from employment, or more people that are taking part-time jobs, that your numbers would your graph would have dipped down a lot lower.
I see.
And that would address that flatness that on the lower end where it should be steeper, and that would impact.
Oh, you mean that?
Going up.
You mean that one? The first one we had.
Right. The fact that.
Yes.
The fact that.
Well,
You might really have
yeah.
a lower unemployment number, and that may mean that
Okay,
might have dipped down a lot lower, so that
Yeah.
reflects why it's so flat.
No, I get your question, and this question comes up every so often. The official unemployment figure, like right now, unemployment is 4.7%. This is the latest data. A lot of people have problems with that. Because basically you only counted as unemployed if you have not worked at all and you are looking for a job. If you have not worked at all and you are not looking for a job, but you would take one if it fell on you, you don't count as unemployed. But BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics that does these numbers, also has other measures, when they include these discouraged people in there, so you could get that data. That, however, is irrelevant to this chart because this chart looks at the number of jobs, not who is counted or not counted unemployed. But there is another problem in the number of jobs. Any job is a job. It doesn't have to be full-time. It doesn't have to be permanent. It's just you have a position, somebody's working in it. It's a job. If it's permanent, even if it's part-time, it doesn't matter. It's all counted as equal in data. And that could create a problem, right? If up here we add in jobs, but they are all like a lot of them are part-time, then that's not the same kind of thing like we did before. Yes, and that unfortunately is not easy for me to differentiate in the data. I spend this amount of time trying to do it and I can't, but maybe there is some other more innovative people who try to figure out how to split the full-time from part-time employment. But in the normal, aggregate statistic for the country, it's not done right now, and it probably should be. I'm guessing, back in the day, decades ago, when they were designing how to collect the statistic, part-time and temporary employment was like a little piece, and they forgot we don't need to, worry. It's a little bit of an error. It's sort of a little misleading part, but it's so small that we don't care. And now it is becoming not so small. They need to care. So maybe.
Impact that whole curve.
Yes, it will, because we were losing permanent jobs over here, and then. Well, this little jump, as an illustration actually, see this little jump? And that is the decennial census in 2010. This is for real. This little jump in the jobs, so suddenly they were like recovering and then they stopped recovering, is all and this is by definition temporary jobs, right? When the Census Department hired all the people to collect the decennial census data. So this is not a non-trivial effect because it shows up. Yeah, so without the decennial census, it'd be something like this, and then up here somewhere. I'm taking a guess, but that's pretty much an illustration of your concern, which is a valid one.